Hello everybody, welcome to this video. So in this one we're going to analyze a mix called the Wonder Woman's Wrath. It's from the Wonder Woman OST, mixed by Alan Meyerson. So I'm going to tell you what I think about it. And before we start, please read the description. So let's go. Okay, so right away we can hear it's a pretty dark mix, which is nice because if you have a dark mix, it means that the sound is not going to be fighting too much with the effects, the sound effects, and the other things that might happen in the mids and high mids. So it's quite a dark feeling mix, but at the same time, it doesn't feel dark like as if it was simply rolled off, because you always have these few elements like the drums high end, the little things, little sharp things, or like the high end from brass staccatos, and that reminds you that there is still some high end. So I really like this curve. This is kind of the dark curve, but with some stuff in the very high end just to catch your ear. And there is a big difference between having a curve like that and having a curve that simply feels rolled off, because if it's just like that, it feels like a cheap MP3 and, it's not interesting. But if you make a track that has lots of low mids, lots of bass, but a pretty dark sound, and then you still have a few things in the treble to poke out and kind of catch your ear, then it kind of brings that hi-fi element back to the sound, and it tells your ear, oh, there is stuff happening in the very high end. So yeah, it's pretty smart to mix it like that, especially for a film soundtrack like that. If, for example, the cello still has a pretty airy high end, but the drums are pretty rumbly and low. Now, talking about the drums, so looking at how this track was mastered, so this is the FLAC version. I don't know if it's like the best master in the world, because you can see it's pretty loud, especially around here. It looks quite squashed. And you can hear that the drums are really turned into a rumble, so we'll come back to that later. But so far, let's talk about the drums here. So I just kind of wish that the accents and the punchiness was a bit better. Like on the boom, 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 boom. Because right now it just kind of feels like the low end is a constant rumble. But I think that it's partly the mastering. But also maybe it was intentional. There is a sort of charm to the rumbliness. And there is definitely some rumbliness that was purposely put in the mix. And that's a decision that is definitely, embraced for this soundtrack, I feel. Because if you just listen to certain parts, like even the quieter parts like here, it's punchier because it's not really hitting the limiter, but still a bit rumbly. It is probably due to the recordings and also having many drums hitting at the same time. So that's something to note. Regarding the brass here in the intro, it's quite mid-rangey, it's not like the sharpest, loudest, bassiest brass ever. But since it's kind of a intro part for the cue right now, I don't really mind it. Like, I don't really mind if the brass is not the bassiest ever. It still sounds quite big with all the drums. Maybe just a tiny bit honky for my taste around there. But at the same time, there is a lot of bass to support the mids. So there's something that I mentioned somewhere, I forgot where, but I mentioned it somewhere, maybe in my book. It's that I feel like the most important ranges to balance are the mids and the lows. And if you have the lows and the mids balanced, then the highs are a bit more optional. They're not as important, because lots of what the humans care about and listen for is the bass and the mids. Like the highs, even old people can't really hear past 10K. So the highs are not as important as having properly balanced mids and lows. And I think it's definitely something that's done here, because if you're gonna have strong mids, kind of, really strong mid-range, you need to have the bass to support it. Otherwise, it feels honky and bass light. So I just probably would cut the brass a tiny bit more, but I think it's great that there is a lot of bass to support all these mids. But yeah, I think the mastering probably made it a bit too rambly here in the bass. You kind of lose the dynamics of the low drums. It's nice to have a clarity in the roll here. Lots of treble. Yeah, definitely lots of low mids. Again, I feel like the drums are a bit too rumbly, and it would be nice to have stronger accents, just kind of emphasizing the rawness and punchiness of the hits in the lows. But I really like how the drums sound in the mids and the highs. When it comes to the brass, I feel like maybe at this point the brass could be a tiny bit clearer, because it's playing pretty glorious intervals. A fifth interval, for example, it's kind of becoming superhero-ish. And you can hear it's pretty buzzy. So obviously the players are playing loud. I just, for my taste, it's a little bit muted and a bit lost in the sea of double basses and drums. I really like this muted sound here of the drums. It's all about the 100 Hz, 120. And I want to take the opportunity to talk about something, is that nowadays with these new tools we have, like a tonal balance control, it's very easy for people to want to aim for a flat mix or like whatever curve you choose. And it's too easy to trust this blindly and just let it influence your mix decisions too much. This mix is obviously very dark, but it has several purposes, such as not stepping too much on the sound effects and I don't know, whatever might be happening in the movie, and kind of sitting in the background, and also not being tiring for long periods of time. So you could listen to this soundtrack for the whole movie and have some action scenes and it wouldn't be too tiring, you know? So that's something that's quite important. It's also an artistic choice, you know? Certain soundtracks will decide to have a lot more aggressive treble because they really want to be listened to. Maybe something that's a bit less underscore-ish, something that's a bit more melodic. Certain soundtracks might decide to be a bit more treble-oriented. But if this track was a lot brighter, it just would lose some of its charm. It would lose some of its weight because lots of the character comes from the low mids. So it's something to be careful with cutting, you know? You can easily cut too much low mids and lose the weight of the track. Suddenly it sounds weird, you know? So yeah, just a little thing I wanted to talk about. So here the drums don't seem to be particularly pushed against the limiter. But the low end is still a little bit rumbly, this part here. So I feel like that's how they were mixed and it was a choice. I really like the tone of the electric cello. Obviously the harmonics here are peaking because it's where the harmonic cello, when the electric cello is. So it's good that it's further on this range and it doesn't need to be shy about it. It can have a ton of harsh high mids or whatever it wants because it's like an aggressive element, obviously. So let all the resonances happen here. It's really nice. So there is a synth bass here, you know, like. And you can hear how wide it is. There is probably the Haas effect on this synth bass, because you can hear it's almost coming from the left and the right at the same time. It has that super extreme width, and that's something that Alan Meyerson really likes to do. And I really love having that super wide synth bass kind of envelope you, you know, especially if you wear headphones, it's going to sound extremely massive. Or in a theater, it's going to sound extremely massive because of the time difference between the left and the right ear, which creates this weird stereo effect. It's called the Haas effect. So this synth bass is taking a lot of room in the mix. Again, here I feel like the drums are a little bit choked, probably due to the limiting, but also due to the way the drums are mixed. They're not mixed to have very punchy transients in the bass. They are mixed to be more rumbly drum. So maybe I feel like here the drums are fighting a bit for space with the synth bass line. We don't really feel any dynamic punch on the drum accents. We mostly just hear them happening in the mids and the highs, but they're kind of they're not really moving a lot of bass energy in the lows. So whether or not that's important to you depends on the intent when mixing. But the stereo width is huge. You can feel it's very, very wide due to the Haas effect. Again, the mix is not that bright. It's very dark, but you know, that's where lots of the vibe comes from. If I was to brighten this, it just wouldn't sound right, you know? These high kind of sharp elements were fine-tuned to just poke through the mix this way. Not more, not less. So it's very nice to have this contrast between the very filtered synth bass and some very sharp sounds like that. With like very sharp harmonics up to 20K. Yeah, something I want to mention. You can hear that the stereo field of the orchestra is very wide, and also the tone of the violins is very smooth. Like it feels like one block, one violin ensemble, and you can't really make out the individual kind of harmonics of each violin. It's a very kind of dense texture, and I think that this is due to the fact that not too many close mics were used. I mean, obviously maybe some close mics, but there is lots of kind of decatry and wide background surround mics. And that definitely participates to the right sound, because it's very important to have the right room and the right decatry and then the right outrigs, surround mics. And if you have that good bass for everything, you're good to go. I mean, this is participating a lot to the sound of the orchestra. The imaging of the brass comes a lot from this decatry and these far away mics. But you can hear there is a very close cello here. So again, there is lots of contrast between the more rumbly distant drums and the distant brass, and the very close cello here. So it's really adding more rhythm by using a close mic on the cello. It's really bringing up to the front and adding more rhythmic content and also more treble, which contrasts with the very dark sounds of the drums, for example. And maybe the drums are a bit rumbly again here. But it's very nice to have just the cello that lives in the high mids and the very dark drums, because now the drums don't really step on the cello. You know, there is no splashy drums going on too much on the cello. It's just mostly dark rumbly drums. So they really are, they have their own space to live, basically. And that's also due to the arrangement being good. So you have some clackiness in the drums, right, around the treble, and you have some rumble, but the high mids are mostly just for the cello. That's what I mean. So all these risers type sounds, you can hear there is some on the left and some on the right. And maybe there is one that oscillates between the left and the right. Either way, it's not just one in the middle. So it really helps a lot to, like, for the overall stereo field of the track, to have one riser left and one riser right, you know, just not having the same sound in the middle. It's really modulating. Maybe there is a panning modulation on one or two sounds, or maybe it's just two separate sounds hard panned. But definitely it's a theme that you can come back to in this mix. For example, the Haas effect on the big synth bass here before. So it really, like, the difference between the left and the right here is something that's very important in this mix. And that's what creates the huge stereo field, you know? Even the drums are wide. But there is one thing that's narrow, it's the cello. It feels like it's a little bit on the right, but the sound has a certain mono characteristic to it. You know, it's not mono, obviously, but there is no like huge wide stereo field going on. It's quite focused, and that's also one more layer of contrast because it's focused and more narrow, and the drums are really wide. So you have this extra layer of contrast in the stereo field. Okay, let's listen to the last part here. I mean, of course, this is a matter of taste, but I would personally have the brass a bit louder and cutting through a bit more. Just to be a bit more glorious and superhero-like. I feel like it's slightly buried in the drums. It's also quite a bit resonant around here, on this note in particular. Maybe just having it a bit more bright and in your face and dense and loud could enhance the harmony to noisy ratio, because the drums are rumbly a bit noisy. And the brass is more doing heroic chords. So maybe having more of these heroic chords come out more clearly in the mix could be nice. Especially the melody, which is still a little bit dark, even though it's bright. So the players are, I mean, it's a bit buzzy, but it's still quite dark, all things considered. The brass is not really EQ'd a lot. It does feel quite natural. And again, this is probably due to the mastering, partly at least. The drums do sound a bit rumbly here. It would be nice to have more low-end punch and definition on every hit, especially the more accented hits. This is really beautiful. I really like this part, but there is a ton of sub, and the sub is basically every spike you see here, it's a sub note. Now there is not this much sub compared to the mids in the other spots of the track. This is the only spot of the track where we feel so much sub compared to the mids, right? and the sub is phasing a bit sometimes, and that phasing is causing these waves here. Maybe it's a little bit much. I would probably tame it a bit around 50 Hz and maybe have it live more around 100 and also a bit more in a stable way. And not as wobbly, but a bit more stable. Because I feel like if you have a big subwoofer, this is going to really be very, very, very bassy. Just my opinion. But I think the high mids and highs sound wonderful. It doesn't need to be brighter than that. It's a very nice amount of brightness for this part here. So yeah, to sum it up, this is a dark mix. And obviously it was made that way on purpose. And the whole OST is pretty dark. Now, I think that the mastering definitely crushed the drums a bit too much, especially in the loud parts here, because you can hear that it's more of a turn into a rumble, and it actually sounds much better when it's not pushed against the limiters as much. Now, the rumble doesn't really matter in the section here with the cello, in my opinion, because it's literally just drums and the cello. And actually, I think there is quite a nice charm to having slightly rumbly drums. It's definitely part of the sound, you know. It's just the separation of the drums in the loud sections. I feel like the low end could be a bit more separated and the brass a bit clearer to get a bit more of that superhero feel. But overall, the stereo field is one of the best things about this track, in my opinion, and the way the Haas effect was used also on the synth is very cool. So yeah, guys, I hope you found this video interesting, and I will see you later. Cheers!